it's Ellie from the Curious Geographer, and on my reading list this week is this book called Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall. So Prisoners of Geography, 10 maps that tell you everything you need to know about global politics. And I would say this is my top #1 recommendation for students studying A-level geography to get them further reading around the topic. Now I have actually just interviewed Tim Marshall, which was super exciting. I was actually quite nervous when I did it because I think his books are fantastic. And we talk about some of the themes that come up. So if you haven't watched that already, definitely check that one out. So this book is just really accessible and gives you such a good understanding of how geography shapes nations' decisions and interactions with other nations around the world. So when we're talking about geography, we are talking both physical and human geography. So the mountains, the oceans around different countries, but also the human geography. So for example, one area that is discussed at the beginning is Russia, and how Russia's geography very much determines how Russia interacts as a nation state. So there's the Arctic Ocean, and that will freeze during the year, and this means that their harbours or their trading can't operate through those ports. And then also, how are they trying to seek for a warm water port that they can access throughout the year? But then also, we look at the kind of human geography as well. So for example, China has very interesting human geography where a lot of wealth is by the ocean areas because there's the ocean cities where there's been a lot of trade. However, there's great poverty in the rural areas. So it kind of looks at those different dynamics. So it takes you through a journey looking at different nations or regions around the world. So as I said, you start with Russia and then you go on to the US and China, and there's lots of different visuals. So you've got big maps here, and Tim kind of explains the kind of key things that are going on in that place. One thing which is particularly interesting, which there's different themes that run through. So China, although China is obviously talked about in the China kind of chapter, it also comes up when we're looking at the US, so potentially the decline of the US superpower status. So the US is quite interesting because it has two oceans. There's the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, and therefore it can have a great global reach through different trade, and that's very accessible. And it's also got just a very big landmass, and there's many things that have contributed to it rising to being a global power and being one of the wealthiest nations in the world. However, China's talked about what is the influence of China today. So China is a rising superpower, but what does this mean? And also particularly, how are they trying to extend their global reach? So that talks a bit about hard and soft power as well. If you studied globalization, which everybody does for A-level, then it links that idea of globalization as well. And globalization as a topic and technology also threads through the book. So for example, Tim talks about the One Belt Road initiative, where China is building new trade routes overground, like the old Silk Roads, to connect different places. So one area they are connecting to is through Pakistan and also the harbour there. It also looks at the relationship between China and Africa, and I think that is a really interesting relationship. So some people think today, is that a form of decolonization? Tim actually thinks that's not the correct word to describe it. Is it more of a cooperative relationship? How can both sides benefit? So if you're interested in Africa and China and that relationship, that's really interesting. Also, geopolitical tensions like South China Sea is discussed, and also different areas which you might not have known too much about, or we don't really study when you are kind of at GCSE. So for example, when I was teaching military intervention a couple of years ago, the Middle East chapter is really interesting, and it just helps you understand how the geography has shaped the interactions between countries in that region. A final thing which is quite interesting, which is discussed in this book, is the idea of global commons. So in the last chapter, Tim looks at the Arctic Ocean, and a global common is an area that is not governed by a single nation state. So how can countries work together, or not work together, to make sure there's not tragedy of the commons or overexploitation? And the Arctic is really interesting because as global warming occurs, there's more accessible to different minerals, oil, which Russia is claiming, but also there is a new trade route. And this trade route will dramatically reduce the amount of time it takes to trade, for example, through China, down through the Suez Canal and to Europe. It's just one trade route example. But through the Arctic, it's much quicker. Russia has these big nuclear power ice-breaking ships that can go through the ice, whereas actually I think the US only has 1 or 2. So which countries are also asserting their influence over oceans and their navies as well. So it's just so interesting. Read it, watch the interview. One thing I have heard from a few students who have gone to universities for open days and talked to the lecturers there is don't make it the only book that you include in your UCAS personal statement, because I think a couple of years ago there was an influx from universities on saying like, oh, I read Prisoners of Geography, and they were like, well, everybody's now read it. So one book that you can read is definitely this, but definitely do wider research or find something in here that you find really interesting and then go on to look at it as well. So that is a top read from me. I hope you really enjoy it. Let me know how you get on and put any comments below as well.